fly so high. I can fly twice as high. Take a look. It's in a book. Reading Rainbow.
Read that rainbow.
Take a look.
Yeah.
It's in that book. It's Reading Rainbow. Welcome back to 1984 by George Orwell. When we left before spring break, some shocking things happened. Julia and Winston were caught. Dun dun dun. By none other than Mr. Charrington, the nice old man that was the antique shop owner, because it turns out he was a member of the Thought Police. At that point, when we ended, we did not know where they were going, because the last line is that it occurred to Winston that for the first time in his life, that he was looking with knowledge at a member of the Thought Police. Book 3, Chapter 1. He did not know where he was. Presumably, he was in the Ministry of Love, but there was no way of making certain. He was in a high-ceilinged, windowless cell with walls of glittering white porcelain. Concealed lamps flooded it with cold light, and there was a low, steady humming sound, which he supposed had something to do with the air supply. A bench or shelf, just wide enough to sit on, ran around the wall, broken only by the door, and at the end opposite the door, a lavatory pan with no wooden seat. There were 4 telescreens, one on each wall. This place sounds pretty miserable. There was a dull aching in his belly. It had been there ever since they had bundled him into the closed van and driven him away. But he was also hungry, with a gnawing, unwholesome kind of hunger. It might be 24 hours since he had eaten. It might be 36. He still did not know. Probably never would know, whether it had been morning or evening when they arrested him. Since he was arrested, he had not been fed. He sat as still as he could on the narrow bench, with his hands crossed on his knee. He had already learned to sit still. If you made unexpected movements, they yelled at you from the telescreen. But the craving for food was growing upon him, and what he longed for above all was a piece of bread. He had an idea that there was a few breadcrumbs in his pocket of his overalls. It was even possible, he thought this because from time to time something seemed to tickle his leg, that there might be a sizable bit of crust there. In the end, the temptation to find out overcame his fear. He slipped a hand into his pocket. "Smith!" yelled a voice from the telescreen. 6079, Smith W. Hands out of your pockets in the cells. He sat still again, his hands crossed on his knee. Before being brought here, he had been taken to another place, which must have been an ordinary prison or a temporary lockup used by the patrols. He did not know how long he had been there. Some hours, at any rate. With no clocks and no daylight, it was hard to gauge the time. It was a noisy, evil-smelling place. They had put him into a cell similar to this one he is in now, but filthily dirty, and at all times crowded by 10 or 15 people. The majority of them were common criminals, but there were a few political prisoners among them. Why might the government starve their prisoners? What do you think? What would that benefit the government to just starve the prisoners? He had sat silent against the wall, jostled by dirty bodies, too preoccupied by fear and pain in his belly to take much interest in the surroundings, but still noticing the astonishing difference in demeanor between the party prisoners and the others. The party prisoners were always silent and terrified, but the ordinary criminals seemed to care nothing for anybody. They yelled insults at the guards, fought back fiercely when their belongings were impounded, wrote obscene words on the floor, ate smuggled food which they had produced from mysterious hiding places in their clothes, and even shouted down the telescreen when it tried to restore order. So what is the difference between the party members and the common criminals? On the other hand, some of them seemed to be on good terms with the guards, called them by nicknames, tried to wheedle cigarettes through the spy hole in the door. The guards, too, treated the common criminals with a certain forbearance, even when they had to handle them roughly. There was much talk about the forced labor camps to which most of the prisoners expected to be sent. It was all right in the camps, he gathered, so long as you had good contacts and knew the ropes. There was bribery, favoritism, and racketeering of every kind. There was homosexuality and prostitution. There was even illicit alcohol distilled from potatoes. The positions of trust were given only to the common criminals, especially the gangsters and the murderers, who formed a sort of aristocracy. All the dirty jobs were done by the politicals. So, what might be a difference between party members as prisoners and ordinary criminals then? Which ones have the upper hand? Which ones are better off? There was a constant come and go of prisoners of every description: drug peddlers, thieves, bandits, black marketeers, drunks, prostitutes. Some of the drunks were so violent that the other prisoners had to combine to suppress them. An enormous wreck of a woman, aged about 60, with great tumbling breasts and thick coils of white hair, which had come down in her struggles, was carried in, kicking and shouting, by 4 guards who had hold of her, one at each corner. They wrenched off the boots with which she had been trying to kick them and dumped her down across Winston's lap, almost breaking his thigh bones. The woman hoisted herself upright and followed them out with a yell of, "Effing bastards!" Then, noticing that she was sitting on something uneven, she slid off Winston's knees onto the bench. "Beg pardon, dearie," she said. "I wouldn't have sat on you, only the buggers put me there. They don't know how to treat a lady, do they?" She paused and patted her breast and belched. "Pardon," she said. "I ain't myself quite." She leaned forward and vomited copiously on the floor. "That's better," she said, leaning back with closed eyes. "Never keep it down, that's what I say. Get it up while it's fresh on your stomach, like." She revived, turned to get another look at Winston, and seemed immediately to take a fancy to him. She put a vast arm round his shoulder and drew him toward her, breathing beer and vomit into his face. "What's your name, dearie?" she said. "Smith," said Winston. "Smith?" said the woman. "That's funny. My name's Smith, too. Why," she added sentimentally, "I might be your mother." She might, thought Winston, be his mother. She was about the right age and physique, and it was probable that people changed somewhat after 20 years in the forced labor camp. So the question on your reading guide says, what do you think about the woman telling Winston that she could possibly be his mother? What do you think of? What do you think about that? No one else had spoken to him. To a surprising extent, the ordinary criminals ignored the party prisoners, the pullets, they called them, with a sort of uninterested contempt. The party prisoners seemed terrified of speaking to anybody, and above all of speaking to one another. Only once, when 2 party members, both women, were pressed close together on a bench, he overheard amid the din of voices a few hurriedly whispered words, and in particular a reference to something called Room 101, which he did not understand. It might be 2 or 3 hours ago that they had brought him here. The dull pain in his belly never went away, but sometimes it grew better, and sometimes worse, and his thoughts expanded or contracted accordingly. When it grew worse, he thought only of the pain itself, and of the desire for food. When it grew better, panic took hold of him. There were moments when he foresaw things that would happen to him with such actuality that his heart galloped and his breath stopped. He felt the smash of truncheons on his elbows and iron-shod boots of his shins. He saw himself groveling on the floor, screaming for mercy through broken teeth. He hardly thought of Julia. He could not fix his mind on her. He loved her and would not betray her, but that was only a fact, known as he knew the rules of arithmetic. He felt no love for her, and he hardly ever wondered what was happening to her. He thought oftener of O'Brien, with a flickering of hope. O'Brien must know that he had been arrested. The Brotherhood, he had said, never tried to save its members, but there was the razor blade. They would send the razor blade if they could. There would be perhaps 5 seconds before the guards could rush into the cell. The blade would bite into him with a sort of burning coldness, and even the fingers that held it would be cut to the bone. Everything came back to his sick body, which shrank trembling from the smallest pain. He was not certain that he would use the razor blade, even if he had got the chance. It was more natural to exist from moment to moment, accepting another 10 minutes' life, even when the certainty that there was torture at the end of it. So basically, Winston is in this awful cell, and he's left torturing over his own thoughts and things that are going on around him, and he's imagining himself being bloodily beaten up by these guard members and tortured, and he can't even bring himself to think of Julia, because at this point he's just so scared for himself that he's mostly just thinking of O'Brien and how O'Brien might be able to try and send him some kind of relief, which, if you were in my class, you remember we had a long discussion of what that razor blade was for, and we all kind of argued or discussed whether or not the razor blade was to help him escape or help him to silence another member or to help him kill himself. And it sounds as if here now the razor blade is in fact for him to potentially kill himself, but there was the razor blade. They would send the razor blade if they could. There would be perhaps 5 seconds before the guards could rush in, and the blade would bite into him with a sort of burning coldness, and even the fingers that held it would be cut to the bone. So Winston is realizing that this razor blade is going to be the savior that would take him from this misery of being brutally beaten. But he also realizes that he's not the type who could actually do that because it's more natural to exist from moment to moment, he says, accepting another 10 minutes of life, even if there's just certainty of it being torture for the next 10 minutes. He'd rather live through that than be one to take his own life. So the question on your reading guide is asking you about the razor blade, that the real purpose of the razor blade has been revealed. I can't see what the question says, but it's somewhere on there. Sometimes he tried to calculate the number of porcelain bricks in the walls of the cell. It should have been easy, but he always lost count at some point or another. More often he wondered where he was and what time of day it was. At one moment he felt certain that it was broad daylight outside, and at the next equally certain that it was pitch darkness. In this place he knew instinctively the lights would never be turned out. It was the place with no darkness. He saw now why O'Brien had seemed to recognize the illusion. In the Ministry of Love, there were no windows. So you remember that part a long time ago, and they've mentioned it a few times about O'Brien and his conversation about them meeting in the place where there is no darkness? After all this time, we had all these ideas of what that meant. And for the first time, Winston is realizing that he recognizes the illusion within the Ministry of Love. They're going to meet in the place where there is no darkness because Winston can't tell what is light and what is dark anymore. His cell might be at the heart of the building or against its outer wall. It might be 10 floors below ground or 30 above. He moved himself mentally from place to place and tried to determine by the feeling of his body whether he was perched high in the air or buried deep underground. There was a sound of marching boots outside. The steel door opened with a clang. A young officer, a trim black uniformed figure, who seemed to glitter all over with polished leather and whose pale, straight-featured face was like a wax mask, stepped smartly through the doorway. He motioned to the guards outside to bring in the prisoner they were leading. The poet Ampleforth shambled into the cell, and the door clanged shut again. I don't know if you guys remember who Ampleforth is, but in the very beginning, when he first gets the note from Julia, and he's trying to have that moment with her where he wants to meet her so badly, and he's walking around the mess hall where the food is, and he's just about to walk up to her, and then that guy interludes, and he's like, "Hey, Winston, come have a seat with me," and Winston's just like grits his teeth and goes and sits down with that guy. That was who Ampleforth is, and he was a poet. Ampleforth made one or two uncertain movements from side to side, as though having some idea that there was another door to go out of, and then began to wander up and down the cell. He had not yet noticed Winston's presence. His troubled eyes were gazing at the wall above a meter from the level of Winston's head. He was shoeless. Large, dirty toes were sticking out of holes in his socks, and he was also several days away from a shave. A scrubby beard covered his face to his cheekbones, giving him an air of ruffianism that went oddly with his large, weak frame and nervous movements. Winston roused himself a little from the lethargy. He must speak to Ampleforth, and risk the yell of the telescreen. It was even conceivable that Ampleforth was the bearer of the razor blade. "Ampleforth," he said. There was no yell from the telescreen. Ampleforth paused, mildly startled, and his eyes focused themselves slowly on Winston. "Ah, Smith," he said. "You too? What are you in for?" "To tell you the truth," he sat down awkwardly on the bench opposite Winston. "There's only one offense, is there not?" he asked. Any guesses as to what that one offense might be? Maybe it's thought crime? "And have you committed it?" "Apparently I have." He put his hand to his forehead and pressed his temples for a moment, as though trying to remember something. "These things happen," he began vaguely. "I've been able to recall one instance, a possible instance. It was an indiscretion, undoubtedly. We were producing a definitive edition of the poems of Kipling. I allowed the word God to remain in the end of the line. I could not help it," he added almost indignantly, raising his face to look at Winston. "It was impossible to change the line. The rhyme was rod. Do you realize that there are only 12 rhymes to rod in the entire language? For days I had racked my brains. There was no other rhyme." The expression on his face changed. The annoyance passed out of it for a moment as he looked almost pleased, a sort of intellectual warmth. The joy of the pedant who had found out some useless fact shone through the dirt of his scrubby hair. "Has it ever occurred to you," he said, "that the whole history of English poetry has been made determined by the fact that the English language lacks rhymes?" No, that particular thought had never occurred to Winston, nor in the circumstances did it strike him as very important or interesting. So basically, Ampleforth is just kind of a word nerd, and he's really excited about the fact that he realized that perhaps poetry is only exciting because in the English language there are not very many rhyming words. And the fact that he was asked to change a poet's writing into newspeak made it impossible for him to change a word like God because there's no word in newspeak that would be a rhyme to God and rod. Well, rod was the only word, and so he couldn't then choose a different word. So he left the word God in there, and now he's just landed himself in jail. The Ministry of Truth, no less, or the Ministry of Love. Do you know what time of day it is? He said. Ampleforth looked startled again. I'd hardly thought about it. They arrested me. It could be 2 days ago, perhaps 3. His eyes flitted around the walls, as though he half expected to find the window somewhere. There's no difference between night and day in this place. I do not see how one can calculate the time. They talked desultorily for some time, and then without apparent reason, a yell from the telescreen bade them to be silent. Winston sat quietly, his hands crossed. Ampleforth, too large to sit in comfort on his narrow bench, fidgeted some side to side, clasping his lank hands from round one knee and then the other. The telescreen barked at him to keep still. Time passed. 20 minutes, an hour, it was difficult to judge. One more than there was a sound of boots outside, and Winston's entrails contracted. Soon, very soon, perhaps in 5 minutes, perhaps now, the tramp of boots would mean that his own turn had come. The door opened. The cold-faced young officer stepped into the cell, and with a brief movement of the hand he indicated Ampleforth. So he pointed his finger at Ampleforth, and he says, Room 101. Ampleforth marched clumsily out between the guards, his face vaguely perturbed, but uncomprehending. We had a bunch of guesses towards the end of before spring break about what Room 101 was, and a lot of you guys suggested that maybe it was a room of torture. And at this point, Ampleforth doesn't know what that means because Ampleforth has just been kind of a blind, whimsical poet. And it's never really crossed his mind that there might be a place as heinous as that. So when they tell him Room 101, he's just like, okay, moving on. But Winston has overheard people talk about it, so Winston knows to fear it. What seemed like a long time passed. The pain in Winston's belly had revived, and his mind sagged round and round on the same track like a ball falling again and again into the same series of slots. He had only 6 thoughts. The pain in his belly, a piece of bread, the blood and the screaming, O'Brien, Julia, and the razor blade. There was another spasm in his entrails. The heavy boots were approaching. As the door opened, the wave of air that it created brought in powerful smell of cold sweat. Parsons walked into the cell. He was wearing khaki shorts and a sports shirt. I hope you guys remember who Parsons is, and if you don't, I will kindly remind you that it is his neighbor, the guy who he works with also, the one whose children are growing up to be spies, and he's so proud of his daughter because she trailed that one guy, and she was like 6 or something, or 4, or young, like she was a young kid, and she trailed that random guy into the woods because his shoes looked funny. And it turned out that he was some spy from some other country, and she'd had him killed, and he was all proud of her. And you guys know that children were to be feared by their parents, right? So, and now Parsons is in the cell with Winston. This time, Winston was startled into self-forgetfulness. You here? He said. Because I don't know if you guys also remember, but Parsons is a 100% rule follower. This guy loves the government. Remember when Winston first talks about him in the very beginning of the book, and he talks about those people that have like the black hair and the beady eyes, and Winston tells us that Parsons is one of those people who will never die because they're just so blindly following of the government. And so Winston seeing him there is just completely shocked. Parsons gave Winston a glance in which there was neither interest or surprise, but only misery. He began walking jerkily up and down, evidently unable to keep still. Each time he straightened his pudgy knees, it was apparent that they were trembling. His eyes had a wide-open, staring look, as though he could not prevent himself from gazing at something in the middle distance. What are you in for? Said Winston. Thought crime, said Parsons, almost blubbering. The tone of his voice implied at once a complete admission of his guilt, and a sort of incredulous horror that such a word could have applied to himself. He paused opposite Winston and began eagerly appealing to him. You don't think they'll shoot me, do you, old chap? They don't shoot you if you haven't actually done anything. Only thoughts, which you can't help. I know they give you a fair hearing. Oh, I trust them for that. They'll know my record, won't they? You know what kind of a chap I was. Not a bad chap in my way. Not brainy, of course, but keen. I tried to do my best for the party, didn't I? I'll get off with 5 years, don't you think? Or even 10 years? A chap like me could make himself pretty useful in a labor camp. They couldn't shoot me for going off the rails just once. Are you guilty? Said Winston. Of course I'm guilty, cried Parsons with a servile glance at the telescreen. You don't think the party would arrest an innocent man, do you? His frog-like face grew calmer and even took on a slightly sanctimonious expression. Thought crime is a dreadful thing, old man, he said sententiously. It's insidious. It can get hold of you without your ever knowing it. Do you know how it got hold of me? In my sleep. Yes, that's a fact. There I was, working away, trying to do my bit. Never knew I had any bad stuff on my mind at all, and then I start talking in my sleep. Do you know what they heard me saying? He sank his voice like someone who is obliged for medical reasons to utter an obscenity. Down with Big Brother. Yes, I said that. Said it over and over again, it seems. Between you and me, old man, I'm glad they got me before it went any further. Do you know what I'm going to say to them when I go up there before the tribunal? Thank you. I'm going to say thank you for saving me before it was too late. Who denounced you? Said Winston. It was my little daughter, said Parsons with a sort of doleful pride. She listened at the keyhole, heard what I was saying, and nipped off to the patrols the very next day. Pretty smart for a nipper of 7, eh? I don't bear her any grudge for it. In fact, I'm proud of her. It shows I brought her up in the right spirits anyway. He made a few more jerky movements up and down, several times casting a longing glance at the lavatory pan, and then he suddenly ripped down his shorts. Excuse me, old man, he said. I can't help it. It's the waiting. He plumped his large posterius onto the lavatory pan, and Winston covered his face with his hands. Smith, yelled the voice from the telescreen. 6079, Smith W., uncover your face. No faces covered in the cells. Winston uncovered his face, and Parsons used the lavatory, loudly and abundantly. It then turned out that the plug was defective, and the cells stank abominably for hours afterwards. In conclusion of that part of Chapter 1, which we did not complete, isn't that crazy about Parsons? Oh my gosh. So his daughter turned him in, and maybe he didn't even say it. Do you think he was really sleep talking? I mean, the guy is completely in love with the government and just believes in the party wholeheartedly. So do you think he really was saying down with Big Brother in his sleep? Do you think his daughter maybe just made it up so that she could get a little bit of fame? I mean, she's only 7, but she's been trained to be a spy since she was a baby. Crazy. To be continued.